Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on November 17th, 2016, and you're listening to Episode 9. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. So let's just dive into the first topic, which is our perennial favorite of housing here in Metro Vancouver. This last week, the City of Vancouver approved its empty home tax, which is Gregor Robertson's partial solution to the problem. Why don't you take us into that?
Okay, so basics are there's going to be a 1% tax levied on empty homes. So for $1 million home, that basically works out to $10,000 a year additional tax. In addition to that, there's going to be a penalty for failure to report because this is a self-reporting tax system here. So there's some questions on enforcement. There's going to be a $10,000 a day fine for failure to report. So yeah, my big concern on this obviously is there is penalties for failure to report. How well is that actually going to be enforced? And will it just end up being a fairly toothless measure even with the penalties?
Yeah, the hope is that by taxing the empty homes, homeowners and landlords will be encouraged to rent them out or to sell them, to basically ensure that this theoretical empty home problem goes away and opens up a bunch more real estate for aspiring homeowners and aspiring tenants. Vancouver does have a very low vacancy rate. So the first question for me is, how many homes are vacant in the city of Vancouver? And we don't know that answer. We don't know that number.
Yeah, there's been a few studies on it, but being fairly weak studies with a lot of variation in terms of the outcome.
So this will at least give us some data on that. I mean, it will be self-reported data with a little bit of checking, but not, door knocking to make sure every home is occupied, because even that wouldn't work. It'll be interesting to see how it goes forward. I'm sure it'll prove somewhat popular, just as the foreign buyers tax proved popular, because I think people in Metro Van are just clamoring for something to be done because housing is that unaffordable.
Well, that's the thing. There's definitely a sense that the government ought to do something. Now, what that something is still up for debate, but I think in general the populace definitely feels some action needs to be taken. And if you just look at the median house price, it's pretty easy to see why. I mean, even a crack house teardown in Vancouver goes for multi-million dollars.
Yeah, and I do like that this policy is less sort of racially tinged than the foreign buyers tax. It focuses on, it doesn't really matter where the landlord lives or is from originally. It's just, are you using that home to live in? And so it sort of shifts the question from this, who gets to buy, to homes are for living in, which is an idea I like.
Yeah, no, it definitely made sense. If there's underutilized assets out there in terms of homes and there's a shortage, having some incentive to put those on the market either for rentals or for purchases makes sense. I just don't get why they're going for the self-reporting route. I kind of pitched this idea earlier on a previous episode of using income tax data to assess whether or not someone's claiming this as a primary residence. And I'm a little curious on why they haven't gone with something with a little more teeth behind it to determine if a house is in fact vacant.
It could be just as simple as the bureaucracy and logistics. I know you're mentioning that this isn't a cheap implementation. This is going to cost a few $1 million to bring in this tax, and it's going to have an ongoing cost. It will most likely pay for itself easily, but you can't just have a new tax and a new bureaucracy without some infrastructure outlay. So I almost wonder if it would have cost more to work with CRA, or if they could even get that data.
Yeah, it probably would have cost more, and not only that, the timeline to implement would have been longer too.
Exactly. So you get the diminishing returns if it takes longer to implement, costs more to implement, and if you don't get that much more money, it's the same sort of problem that the Fairgates have on the SkyTrain here in Metro Vancouver. TransLink brought in the Fairgates on the assumption that there's a lot of fare hoppers and people not paying their way onto the SkyTrain. And they brought in the compass cards as a way to help track that as well, at least as one reason. but the cost of implementation has greatly exceeded the sort of marginal numbers that I've seen of people who are fare hoppers. There are a lot of people who just jump on the 99 or just jump on the SkyTrain, but the trains are so cheap that spending $1 billion or whatever they spent on the gates just wasn't necessarily worth it. So maybe the city was worried about spending $1 billion on bringing in a tax that didn't get any money.
Yes. Yeah, that's definitely a valid concern there. And I guess we'll have to see what the numbers are once the next tax season's data comes in.
One of the other things that came up is there's different approaches, of course. Today we saw John Horgan, leader of the NDP, propose a sort of, let's put more money into co-op housing. And this somewhat gets at what David Dodge, the ex-governor of the Bank of Canada, also was pointing that there's a supply problem. And this is something we've talked about as well, that there's only so much land to go around and there's only so many houses. If we're not building more, there won't be more affordable houses, obviously. So the NDP's pitch is at that sort of lower income group by saying, let's expand co-op housing, which is somewhat niche and shrinking, it feels like, in Vancouver. There's quite a few co-ops around, but they all have very long waiting lists, and the people who get in them then sort of cling to them because you don't want to give up that sweet deal.
Yeah, it's the same problem you see with rent control, where people have a tendency to stay put and hunker down once they get a good unit or even an okay unit that's under market value. And in this case, Horgan's promising to budget about $11 million to replace an existing federal subsidy that's expiring. So it's questionable how much this particular proposal will change it. The NDP's definitely voiced support for co-op housing in the past, so I expect to see them announce other policies regarding this, but this one here, you're probably not going to shift the number of units too much with this one policy.
It's something that will play popular with their base for sure. The core NDP voter isn't, a rabid socialist, but the idea of a sort of social co-op is appealing. It's that sort of democratic socialism that I think a lot of people have who are the core NDP voters. So it's a nice way to sort of shore up their vote months before the election. Then they can put maybe those broader appealing policies out in a few months.
Yeah, and you were talking about the supply thing. I'm not sure a market-oriented pitch is necessarily going to appeal to that base. So I think the co-op thing definitely speaks the NDP language more and will help shore that up.
Absolutely.
So yeah, David Dodge, former Bank of Canada governor, also worked for CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, came out recently saying that we need to expand supply in the Toronto and Vancouver areas. One of the big things he pointed out was that housing prices for most of the country are flat or falling, and that these are really localized issues both in the Metro Vancouver area and the Golden Horseshoe, and that we need to focus on a more local solution rather than hitting the broad countrywide macro buttons.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because some of the ideas that have been pitched at the Conservative Party leadership race have been those more national ideas. We talked sort of derisively about Michael Chong's wonky idea, not that the idea itself was necessarily bad, but that it was very wonky CMHC specific issue. But if you have the, one of the experts essentially saying this isn't actually a problem for most Canadians, it's almost a question mark if they should be taking a position on this as an issue. Of course, they're in a leadership race, so they need to shore up the votes.
And perhaps more importantly, they're in a federal leadership race, and the federal government is pretty limited in what it can do in those respects. I mean, part of the reason why you get those wonky proposals for CMHC or to try and, or there's talk about whether or not the Bank of Canada should be raising interest rates to try and cool the market. And you only get those proposals because those are the few federal levers that exist for housing. With the supply thing, it's much more about what the city of Vancouver, what their zoning laws are, what their permitting process is like.
Well, and you're not going to see people in the Conservative Party leadership race campaign on a huge federal stimulus for affordable housing, they're just not going to say we should, because Canada used to have a lot of federal money going into affordable housing, and that's just sort of rolled away under the Chrétien and following governments. And it's not going to be, Maxime Bernier who comes forward and says, here's $1 billion to build cheap homes or affordable homes in Vancouver.
Yeah, and I think there's a fairly solid argument on why that would don't necessarily want to do that, in that because you have a market that's already being distorted quite a bit with these supply restrictions, and then trying to come in and subsidize a bunch more stuff doesn't seem to make sense. It's kind of like holding the brake down and pressing on the gas at the same time, where it might be better just to ease off both levers and try and reach an equilibrium that way.
You can always have that mixture of analyzing some of the policies that are in place and some of the zoning rules, but then maybe throwing a bit more money into building some of the affordable housing so that you can, attack it from multiple angles. But we'll have to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, the only point I'd add to that is that it's easier to build affordable housing when the overall market is not as high and you don't have to shell it as much money to even just acquire the land to build that affordable housing on.
So there's been a number of developments on the electoral reform front on the national level. The committee that's supposed to give its final report, we're still waiting on that. They have another 2 weeks, I think, roughly, to let us know what they've decided. But in the meantime, the committee managed to get Mariam Monsef, the Democratic Reforms Minister, to show her work or at least they asked her to. They asked her to report on what she had heard at the town halls she held around the country, because she held her own in addition to what the committee was doing. Instead, she gave some bullet points rather than a sort of breakdown of what everyone said. And she just basically gave 3 positions that she felt conveyed everything she heard at something like 80 different town halls.
So the first item, that there's some enthusiasm for electoral reform, but there's no clear consensus around which it should be. No one system emerged as the obvious, this is what Canadians want. Second theme was that there were some consensus around the basic values and structure that the system should have. It should focus on local representation, encouraging greater voter participation and engagement, and guarding the integrity of the voting system. And the final theme was that Canadians are clear they want a more inclusive and accessible system that support groups that are traditionally underrepresented.
And that's people like women, Indigenous people, young people, visible minorities, people with disabilities, of course. That first point, though, is the one that's obviously getting the biggest headlines, that there's no clear consensus, because the Liberals have started to talk a lot more about a national consensus on this. And it's such a cop-out on sort of my point of view. They've not really pushed any reform forward. And so we saw in the PEI plebiscite, where they were given a number of options, the people who want change from first past the post are split. Not exactly evenly, but across a bunch of different options. If you let people choose between MMP, STV, dual member proportional, which is a new system that's being talked about in Canada, and other systems, people will have their preferences, and there's different reasons to support different ones of them, because as we discussed, none of them are perfect. So to say there's no clear consensus is such a not useful, it's not adding anything to the conversation. Of course, that's going to be the case. I was kind of hoping that a government that campaigned on we're going to get past first past the post would pitch something. Instead, they've just said, all right, well, we'll get rid of this if you guys can figure it out, without really, there's no leadership here. What the problem is.
And that was one of the sticking points for me I've had and why I do think you need something a little more to achieve that democratic mandate than that one almost throwaway line in the Liberal platform. They spent, I believe, 2 sentences on it in their 2015 platform. And in the year since then, they haven't really elaborated too much more on what they're looking for.
So we're still hoping for that, and they're not taking any initiative, it seems, to come up with that idea. That's left the committee sort of aimless, and it looks like the NDP is actually trying to drive towards a consensus at that committee, and they've said they will accept a referendum now, a sort of hard, sharp turn from their previous positions, if that means they can get to something. So that signal from Nathan Cullen to me means they're starting to make deals, and they're starting to think about what that they have to be starting to think about what that final report is. It's due in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and one of the Conservative members, Scott Reid, on the committee has said that he would be open to put in proportional representation to a referendum in the past. So this is kind of the NDP and the Conservatives coming together on the issue and splitting the difference, essentially. Now, what this does leave them is one vote short of a majority on the committee. So they'll either have to pick off Elizabeth May or the one bloc member on the committee, or possibly convince one of the Liberals.
From what I've heard of Elizabeth May's comments on the issue, she's not a huge fan. She's sort of skeptical of the referendum, but I wouldn't be surprised if she came to it as a path and she said, you know, I'll go with this if that gets us to proportional representation, and we'll campaign hard. What I suspect the NDP particularly wants is a unanimous report. If they can come out of there with all of the members from all the parties agreeing, that'll be a lot stronger than, you know, if the opposition members put forward a plurality report and the Liberals are left with a sort of minority report to that leaves a lot of big questions in the air, and that's a good way for the government to wash their hands of it and say, look, we couldn't get to a consensus at this committee. We've put it to this national debate, which they've now also announced. So the government's also now talking about putting this to a national discussion. They're going to send postcards to every household and launch an online consultation tool to engage as many people respond to it as they can. I suspect that will be a small number. There'll be a lot of people who just throw them out, like they throw out your MP newsletter.
Yeah, I'm not sure how representative a sample you're going to get, because it is... I mean, you're obviously asking everybody, but the people who actually respond are going to be a self-selected bunch on this. And you're going to get the same problem you had with the town halls, is that the people are really motivated on the issue. They're going to be responding right away. They're definitely going to be there, and they're going to be probably overrepresented in the sample compared to the average Canadian.
Well, that's almost true of a referendum as well. If the referendum's not tied to a general election, you're only going to get people who have strong opinions on it. That's what we saw in the PEI plebiscite, when only 35 to 40% of people actually responded in a province where people vote in very high numbers. And even if you do tie it to a general election, we're only seeing 60% of people turn out, and there's no reason people have to check a box on a referendum question beside their ballot. So you will still have some selection bias. That's inevitable. There's going to be a lot of people who just don't care. I don't know what you do to account for that.
Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things about this mail-out is there was a report today that the questions had been leaked. And there's definitely been some criticism on that. So, Fair Vote Canada apparently got an advanced copy of this, or someone leaked it to them. And the questions that have been released from them show a very vague series of questions. They're asking questions such as, would you prefer to have small parties in Parliament that represent a lot of different views, or big parties? Are you satisfied with the way democracy works in Canada? But yeah, they're asking rather vague, broad questions without detailing the systems, exactly what they are. Nathan Cullen called it a pop psych survey. So there's a lot of criticisms behind this on whether or not they're actually going to get a good sense of what Canadians actually want in a system, and they're not actually presenting the options directly to them. Now, these details are still coming out. We don't know if this is the final wording of the survey or anything yet, but there's definitely some concerns there.
It wouldn't be surprising if this is the direction they went based on everything they've done so far and what we've seen. As you say, without a clear question in front of you, they can derive whatever results they want from that. That's, the questions you talk about that are in this draft aren't useful. Leadership on this file is putting a system out there, is saying, we're going to put our money on this one. We've thought about it. Instead, this is the kind of survey they should have done 6 months, 8 months ago, like day one of their mandate, even a year ago. And then they could have had some direction of, people wanted these values. Instead, they sort of started their mandate for this committee with the values that they're going to find out, that people want a local representative, that people like democracy, that people like big parties and they like small parties.
Yeah, and going back to those 3 points that the minister raised, the third one was almost word for word from their initial talking points on the matter. So it does at least make one a little suspicious that they are looking for the results they want.
Well, they've heard the results they wanted. The question is, what else have they heard, if anything? And we don't know because they're holding on to those records for now. So I guess we're waiting for the committee now to tell us what it's heard.
Yeah, I feel a lot more confident about this if they had a detailed breakdown of, these are the various systems we're considering. These are, some rough pros and cons, or maybe not even pros and cons. That might be a little too loaded language, but features of the system, and get Canadians' feedback on that. But these kind of broad, high-level ones aren't that useful when you actually have to pick a system at the end of it.
And it's not even that they have to put all their money on one system, like I just said. They could do like PEI just did and say, here's a list of systems that are out there. It's not that they've necessarily endorsed one, but there are different options, and put it to the voters in a ranked ballot sort of situation that lets them sort of say, all right, these are my favorites, but I would also accept these other ones because they're similar enough.
Yeah, like I prefer single transferable vote, but I'd happily accept its member proportional.
And there's people who would prefer first past the post to alternative vote because of the biases it can introduce. So there's a lot of logic to having that approach. I don't see any logic to the current government's approach other than to try to kick the can to not come to a consensus and to ditch the issue.
Yeah, and that's definitely the concern, because Trudeau's made some comments that, Canadians aren't quite as enthusiastic about electoral reform as they once were. And it does seem to indicate between this and those previous comments, the Liberals might be looking to back off a bit on that, which honestly doesn't really surprise me, because they have been the single greatest beneficiaries of first past the post in the last century. And they only really put the idea forward when they were in third place, and it looked like they were going to be losing out on it for once.
Yeah, it was definitely something that was popular among the sort of core base who was left at their darkest days. There were people who went, the system's not fair, we need to solve this big problem. And there's that core base in the NDP as well, and I think it's almost unanimous in the Green Party, essentially, the support for electoral reform. And a lot of those Green and Liberal voters have been moving around for a while. So I can see why they pitched it, and I totally understand. And I can also understand the political realities of why they're trying to back away. I'm hopeful still a little bit that they won't, but...
Yeah, it's made enough of a splash right now that they will take a hit from backing away from it. The question is, how big a hit is that? I know I've definitely seen comments to the effect of, I voted Liberal this time. If they don't actually pass this, I won't be voting for them again. I don't know how representative that is.
I think it's even bigger hit than that, though. If they go back on this was seen as one of their big promises. I can see people who don't care seeing it as Liberal backtracking or Liberal breaking promises, and that's a bigger issue for them, that accountability that they ran on and that they sort of challenged the Conservatives over to some extent. And the big part of the Chrétien issue right when he first was elected in his first term was going back on promises, and that kept building into a bigger and bigger issue. And that wasn't the only thing that brought him down, but Liberals breaking promises became the sort of mantra of the 90s.
Yeah, and there's a concern here for the Liberals that this is going to build into a narrative. It might not be the breaking promises, but it might be the not getting stuff done. they've taken some flack for basically a year into it, having barely advanced on many key files, and the ones they have either been, quick, easy wins that don't require any political capital, really, or ones where their hands being forced, like the assisted dying, where they hit a deadline and had to act. And I think we're going to see that going forward.
Well, speaking of Liberals sort of breaking promises, the other on electoral reform, we also have the PEI plebiscite that they had a result from, which said they wanted to see mixed member proportional. It won on the fourth ballot after sort of coalescing all of the proportional representation votes together. But the turnout was so low, the Premier didn't feel there was that consensus. So now he's announced
the intent to proceed with a binding referendum on the matter. And that's definitely got a lot of pushback from the opposition, who see this as, the plebiscite might not have been binding, but it definitely sent a clear enough message the government should honor it. And they see this as a way to weasel out of it.
And the other problem there is they want to tie it to the next election, which isn't until October 2019. So that allows them to push the issue another 2 years away, at which case maybe people won't care. Maybe the coalitions that came together, I imagine, to support electoral reform in PEI will have dissipated somewhat. Or maybe that'll be a good amount of time to build a new effort. But I can just imagine the struggle and frustration among activists there to go from rallying all your people to vote in this plebiscite to having to do the exact same thing again. It's sort of what happened in BC, where we had a clear mandate for BC STV, but it wasn't the official mandate of 60%. We had 57%.
59. So we were 1% off.
And so they said, well, we'll just do another referendum. But then people were grumpy that they had to do another referendum, and there were reconsiderations or more inertia of the political parties, because both the NDP and BC Liberals have benefited under first past the post, and BC STV was defeated more roundly in that second referendum. I think it almost delegitimizes a question to keep going back to it.
Yeah, the term's been thrown around in the context of Quebec, but a never-endum, where you keep wanting to ask the question again and again until you get the answer you want.
So we'll keep an eye on PEI, find out what's going there, and we'll keep an eye on the federal government. Speaking of the federal government, we had a question sort of about, after our last two-part episode, the first half, which we called episode 7, was all about the US election. And we talked a little bit about the ramifications for Canada, and it was still very fresh and raw in our minds, so I think we just needed a decompression to get the terror off our chest after
the vent, at the very least.
Exactly. And so we didn't do a deep dive into all of the different possible angles. We did look at a few of them.
Yeah, so one thing we did touch on there is the NAFTA question, which is resurfaced again. Trump has started to make moves on it. Canada and Mexico have both announced they're willing to talk on the issue. The two leaders have consulted each other prior to making that announcement, so we are kind of working with the Mexicans on how to proceed with a NAFTA renegotiation. And on the American side, the Trump team has announced they're intending to deal with beef and softwood lumber as kind of two major issues going forward.
And those are hugely important to Western Canada and especially BC. The softwood lumber file is a perpetual issue, as we said.
And it's worth noting that these are kind of the two big issues that the U.S. has typically lost on in whenever the trade disputes have gone to arbitration.
And so it'll be something to follow of whether they dig their heels in on this and really try to push it and use this as their reason to start tearing up parts of NAFTA or carving it apart. And maybe it won't be a full-sale repeal as Trump promised, but the way digging exemptions out to protect U.S. industries and to get better deals.
Yeah, and I was admittedly kind of hoping that if we had to go back to the negotiating table on this, we could at least toss something that doesn't really benefit Canadians, but we, for some reason, keep fighting about, which is the supply management. It's been a constant sticking point during NAFTA, the TPP negotiations, CETA, and we've given in other areas on that. But it's a policy that hurts Canadians, and it'd be really nice to just ditch it altogether. But if we're now focusing on these areas, that makes me less hopeful for that.
It's going to be messy, that's for sure. It's going to test Trudeau, and it's going to really test his support in the West if he, sells out BC softwood lumber and he sells out Alberta beef. I mean, he doesn't have a ton of rural votes in either of those provinces, but it could be a sort of fire to reinvigorate the Conservative Party around specific trade issues, which is something I don't think they've talked a lot about in their leadership debates. They've focused on, there's been a couple comments, of course.
It was something that's come up in both of the leadership debates that have happened. How to deal with free trade going forward and an American president who isn't all that keen on it.
I guess their focus has been largely on Kelly Leitch's terrible Canadian values talk.
And that was the Kelly Leitch was another issue that got brought up in this comment, is what were the domestic implications for Canada?
So there's a question of, is Canada immune to this sort of rhetoric? There's the concern Indy brought up in his well-written comment was the idea that Trudeau does represent the liberal, he's the epitome of liberal elite. He's got the name of a former prime minister.
He was literally born into 24 Sussex.
Yeah,
his family was living there.
Silver spoon in mouth, of course. So you couple that with, he did run on a change platform, but he hasn't delivered to the level that I think a lot of people were hopeful. He's bungled a lot of files. He's gone to committees and consultations rather than action.
And even the change platform he ran on, it was really to kind of change things back to 10 years ago. It wasn't a huge, bold, new direction so much as returning to the pre-Harper times. It was almost a Make Canada Great Again approach.
It was a Make Canada Liberal Again.
Yes.
And that's where they feel like it should always be. But that's a natural governing party.
We have kind of, I think, bucked the trend a bit because that is where our change election went. We kind of shifted a little leftward where a lot of the other countries are shifting rightward.
That said, I think there is still a lot of fear, racial resentment in Canada. I mean, there's racist acts being reported on a daily basis in America and Canada now. We're seeing synagogues defiled. We're seeing Nazi symbols and anti-Semitic messages, which I thought hadn't gone away, of course, but it's so 1940s and older. I thought it's not that hate had moved on, but it had found different targets and was focused more on Muslims and the gay community and others, but apparently they're still anti-Semites. Yeah,
well, it's been a fairly consistent low-level thing for a decade. It's gotten a lot more attention in the last couple months. And I'm actually kind of a little curious to see what the long-term trends are on this, and how much of it's a function of an actual change in the culture and whatnot, and how much of it's the media is focusing on it in light of recent events.
And reporting will spike when there's more coverage, because then people think to report the hate crimes they've seen. That said, the numbers have, as far as I know, been up in the last 2 years over the 2 years prior to that.
Yeah, and we definitely see some stuff here in Canada. And at least with the BC, as we talked a bit about last episode, there's, I think, some concerns that the real estate tensions will bubble over a bit, in that Chinese buyers definitely seem to be a target of resentment.
Yeah, I've heard stories of, and it was in the news over the summer, of a Chinese realtor whose signs were continually defaced in racist ways. People were cutting out the her Chinese name on her real estate signs and leaving the English. And this has come up repeatedly in Richmond. Just today I saw that alt-right recruiting posters were circulating around the town. So the low level is there, and we can definitely see Kelly Leitch playing into that. She is, of course, the awkward elite trying to play into it.
Yeah,
and so maybe
there's a missing authenticity there. I mean, Donald Trump is like the epitome of an economic elite, but culturally he never really fit the mold, and that gave him an authenticity that Kelly Leitch just does not have. You need a Rob Ford character. If anybody should be running on that platform, it should be Doug Ford, not Kelly Leitch, because he can actually bring that forward. Not that I want to see that.
I was going to say, don't give him any ideas.
But that is where a more successful version of that campaign would be found.
At the same time, I think we are seeing these schisms and fault lines start to divide in Alberta politics, at least. We saw this a little bit last week where the two women running for the Progressive Conservative leadership dropped out of the race. Sandra Jensen specifically citing harassment and sexism and misogyny within the Progressive Conservative Party and some of the members. The big news today was she's now jumped ship to the Alberta NDP, because I guess Rachel Notley had the shrewd political sense to extend the olive branch to her to say, "We're sorry you don't feel welcome in your party. We're the moderate center party of Alberta now, the NDP," and they invited her in, and the comments were overwhelmingly positive from Sandra, and as far as I could see, Sandra spoke about how within an hour of the announcement, 10 NDP MLAs had called her or expressed, messages of support. She didn't hear from anyone from her old Progressive Conservative caucus, probably because they're feeling a bit burned and bitter. The interim leader, Rick McIver, did express we hope she enjoys her new job. Platitudes, nothing mean, but it just kind of shows that the more moderate wing of the Progressive Conservative Party is still being eaten by the NDP, and the rest of it is kind of drifting more and more to the Jason Kenney, let's just become part of the Wild Rose.
Yeah, I do see that happening, and I think it's less pronounced in Alberta politics, but I think in general there's the early stages of political realignment going on, where economics is no longer like the major dividing line, and it's not particularly pronounced at the provincial level, but national level, you're seeing a lot of that. And within the provincial context of Alberta, there are signs that that's changing, with the NDP coming to the forefront and adopting a much more just progressive, climate-friendly approach.
Well, what you're seeing in Alberta, I think, is the NDP is really consolidating the progressive urban votes. It's held strongly in Edmonton for a number of years to 2 or 4 seats, and that's now grown to the entire city. And I think as the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta continues to implode, the NDP is going to sweep Calgary. Or not all of it, but the NDP is just really sucking up all the oxygen because it's doing the things it said it would.
Yeah, and it is the natural tendency under a first-past-the-post system for the political spectrum to reduce down to 2 main parties, and that's what's happening in Alberta with the NDP kind of consolidating from the center on leftward. And I think the other interesting question is that consolidation going to happen on the right?
You have to remember, Alberta for 40 years was one-party politics. It was the Progressive Conservative Government of Alberta, and everyone else squabbling over crumbs. So it's not even necessarily that it's a bunch of parties coming to 2. It's that fell apart, and now it's that realignment. And I think you're right, we will see it come to the 2-party system like we have in BC, like has effectively developed in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where you have the NDP and everyone else who doesn't want the NDP. And I know there were a lot of people when the NDP were elected who were saying, well, this is going to happen in Alberta now. It's going to be NDP versus everyone else. The last thing I think I can say about the difference in Canada and the States is we are a more urbanized, more educated country. 2 things that worked against Trump were people who had more than a college degree, who had university postgraduate degrees. He didn't do as well in those demographics. He also didn't do as well in cities. Canada is a more urban country. We don't have a bunch of small towns in the same way they do in the US. we don't have that. You can see just in the Conservative Party of Canada has not ever really done well in downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver. They've picked off some of the suburbs, and it'll be interesting to see how the suburbs sort of respond going forward.
Yeah, and that's a question I think is really going to depend on who comes out ahead on the Conservative leadership race. A Conservative Party led by Maxime Bernier or Michael Chun will look a lot different than one led by Kelly Leitch or Brad Rose isn't going to get the leadership, but who gets selected as leader is going to have a huge impact on how the party presents itself and whether or not it can win. And while I'm hopeful a Conservative Party led by Kelly Leitch wouldn't be able to win a general, I'm a little less hopeful now than I was 2 weeks ago on that. I think the thing that's Trump's victory has shown is that you can't necessarily assume that people will necessarily see the candidate the same way you do and respond in the numbers that you want to defeat them, and that you kind of need to be a little more proactive. You saw that in last general election in BC, where the NDP kind of were a little complacent and were like, everybody knows how terrible the Liberals are. We kind of have to just not be as bad. And Clinton ran the same campaign, had a similar problem where there was a lot banking on, my opposition's clearly terrible. I'm the natural shoo-in for this as long as I don't screw up. And I don't think that's a viable strategy going forward or even in the past. And you really have to present why people should vote for you, not just how terrible the other person is.
Yeah, we can't be complacent. I like to think that the demographics and the sort of overall likelihood of it happening here are less, but who knows?
Yeah, we do have a few structural advantages. We don't have, or the Conservatives aren't running the same system as the Republicans did. It's going to be a single ranked ballot rather than a series of largely first past the post, some proportional elections that lead up to it where people will drop off as the ballots are counted and different states are won. So that ranked ballot, I think, is going to make it a little harder for a Kelly Leitch-like person who's either has really strong support or is disliked and doesn't reach that middle ground too well. But like I said, it's less obvious now that that's necessarily going to happen. People will see. Obviously, I guess I'm a little
like you said, Toronto elected Rob Ford. He essentially ran from controversy to controversy, from scandal to scandal, and became a national embarrassment. But there were people who thought he was the greatest ever because he was taking on the gravy train. So
yeah, and he still had fairly broad support when he was running for, and even after the scandals broke, and during the lead up to the mayoral election, which he ultimately didn't run in because of health reasons. And that, I think, really shows the power of building a strong narrative and how it can shield some of the personal deficiencies of a candidate if they have a strong narrative they're working with. And Trump was able to do that. I think Kelly Leitch is less able to build that strong narrative. I mean, her views are resonating with some people, but I'm not sure has that authenticity factor and can really build that narrative. And I definitely don't see that happening in a general, but we just saw how horribly wrong a bunch of predictions got, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt.
Well, let's close off with two quick stories. First, the Liberals have introduced an act related to the repeal of Section 159 of the Criminal Code, or more popularly known as the repeal the anal sex provision. Canada's criminal code is very outdated. It's a big, clunky document where big chunks of it have been struck down by the courts. Other portions are never implemented. This one provision, Section 159, states that every person who engages in an act of anal intercourse is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to an imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years, or is guilty of an offense punishable on summary conviction.
Put that into a more well known, if a little disappointingly so, because that's an American terminology rather than Canadian. It was basically our equivalent of a felony, and that has now been repealed. It hasn't been enforceable for years, but it has clunked up the criminal code like so many other provisions.
Well, but it actually has been used. The Ontario courts supposedly struck it down in 1995, but police keep charging people with it. That happened between 2008 and 2014. According to one report, 22 different people were charged with it, and 2 of them were youth. It's long been opposed by LGBTQ equality groups because this is a law that is clearly targeting gay men and saying, don't do that lewd thing, even though it's consensual. And if it's not, we have laws against that. So the fact it's been on the books has been an embarrassment to the country. And so it's definitely a good thing to finally get to repealing it.
I suppose the bigger question is, why did they only repeal this one provision? As we were mentioning, there's a lot of stuff in there that shouldn't really be in there anymore because it has been struck down. Just recently we had a judge convict someone of, I believe it was Section 230 on manslaughter, and that has been struck down as unconstitutional, and yet he either screwed up or, well, he obviously screwed up, and I'm not sure if he just missed that or just pulled something out of the criminal code without checking the case law on it, or whatever the reason is. The fact that it was in there led to a bit of a problem when he then convicted a person with that and then had to go back and they had to effectively change the decision on there. And it was a huge problem. They ended up correcting the oversight, but it was a big embarrassment for the judge, bit of a black eye for the legal system in general. And it's one of those things that you think would be able to be cleared up fairly easily.
Well, we have other laws in there that haven't been struck down but just don't get used. One that I've campaigned hard against with the BC Human Association and other free thought groups is the blasphemy law. Canada's criminal code criminalizes blasphemous libel for a prison term not exceeding 2 years. So in theory, you could be sent to jail for publishing a blasphemous libel, which is not actually defined in the code, which is in and of itself a problem. This section hasn't been prosecuted since the 30s, I believe. There was a case in the 1980s when an Anglican tried to shut down a screening of a Monty Python film and tried to instigate a private prosecution. And it was only because the Attorney General of Ontario at the time looked at this and said, no, I can't in good conscience let that go through. But there's no reason that couldn't happen again. Like, people could start to try to enforce these laws. And one of the fundamentals of our justice system is that ignorance of the law is no excuse. I mean, another section of the criminal code that does get used occasionally is the ban on fraudulent witchcraft and fraudulent sorcery.
Well, isn't fraudulent a little redundant in that description?
One would think. The way this specific section tends to get used is against people who clearly scam unfortunate victims out of their life savings by saying they'll tell them their fortune, or worse. And they know it's not true when they scam these people. I guess if you have real mystical powers, that's okay. But these are the kind of anachronistic 19th century laws that are on the books. Some of them are being used. Why not just bring a law commission back or bring a study and just clean it up, because it's a mess?
Yeah, I mean, omnibus bills aren't popular, but this is one of those sort of things where it would make a lot of sense just to use one, sweep clear all of the stuff that's being ruled unconstitutional, just clean it up all in one. It wouldn't be that hard. You don't even have to wait for the government to do it. This could be a private member's bill.
There's problems with changing the criminal code by private member's bill, of course. They tend not to be as studied as a government bill, and you'd want to see, the government take this on.
But in this case where there's, clear these ones have been ruled unconstitutional, I don't see it being such a big problem.
I think with this specific bill, the government put it as part of their LGBTQ sort of move forward. They've also named Randy Boissonette, I might be mispronouncing that, their Liberal MP from Alberta, one of them, Randy's been given a portfolio to oversee ways to improve LGBTQ equality. Prime Minister Trudeau's looking at apologizing for and pardoning those who've been convicted of homosexuality under past laws. And so it's a lot of sort of reparations for past transgressions of the federal government, many of which are long overdue. And so it's a nice gesture, at least, and I'm not going to condemn them for doing at least this.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And it is nice that they're finally moving along on this. Although, I think it does go into a bit of what we were talking about earlier, where it's one of those easy wins, and it's, they're moving forward on this, and it's good they are, but you don't have to spend a lot of political capital. This doesn't change the facts on the ground that much, and I kind of wonder when the big substantive stuff's going to start showing up.
Yeah, this is a year into their mandate, and they're only just getting to it now.
Yeah, and it's easy, looks good on the surface, but doesn't actually change anything.
Well, finally, our parliamentarians, our members of parliament, have voted, and they've determined that Thomas Mulcair is the Parliamentarian of the Year. They commended his performance in the House of Commons, particularly after he was rejected both by the Canadian people, to some extent, in the last election, and by his own party when he failed to even get a majority of his delegates' support. But Mulcair has long been known for his positive ability and his talent and skill in the House of Commons, so this isn't surprising.
He's considered to be one of the best leaders of the opposition in decades, and that was never his problem. The problem was that fiery parliamentarian kind of just disappeared as soon as he walked out the door of Parliament. And if he'd brought that to the campaign, I think he probably would have done a little better, but
it feels almost like it's a pity vote. Like, He is a good parliamentarian, and no one doubts that, but sort of awarding it to him now is almost like a pat on the back on the way out the door, like a participation medal for coming out, even though he can't have a bigger prize, which it just feels kind of sad. We can't let him retire. And I almost wonder if this isn't a way for him to sort of keep clutching on if no one comes forward, if he's going to use this sort of caucus support he has and the prestige he has within Parliament to say, look, I am the best man for the job to keep leading the NDP.
Yeah, well, we've still 11 months left, and the rate the NDP leadership's going, he might have a lot more time than that.
So we'll keep following the ongoing saga of Thomas Mulcair and whether he will stay or go.
And that has been Politicos. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.